Today we'll be going over regions, sites, and subsites in our training. So learning objectives for today, we want to understand sites, subsites, and regions. We also want to understand how to code those sites and regions. So we want to understand the site and region coding conventions, and we'll look at some best practices for that. We'll learn how to create and edit the site data fields, which are site type, site status, and site information. We'll also look at how to actually and practically create and edit sites, and also create and edit regions in your projects. We'll also look at when those might be useful for you to use and when you wouldn't have to use those things. Finally, we'll come on to custom views, and we'll look at how they can help you in organizing your site dashboard. So the chapters of this class are going to be: what is a site, site creation and editing, regions, subsites, site types, site information, site status, and custom views. I'll be going through the slides. As I said before, the slides will be up. I'll also, during this presentation, pause for seconds, and I'll do demonstrations on site, so you can really get a sense of how to do the things I go over today. So we'll start off with what a site is. So all projects in Site Manager are organized around sites. So they're the main thing that you need in order to have any kind of project or activity ongoing in Site. So it's very flexible what a site is. There's not that many rigid rules. What a site would need to be for it to exist at Site in Site is that it should have a specific address, a point, or exist within a given area. It can, however, be any structure. So that could be some kind of campsite. It could be any building. It could be a office building, for example. It could be any facility or service point even. It could be a water point. It could be a latrine or an object. So again, there are no rigid rules here, and maybe the word site in itself will, for all of us, we'll think about displacement sites, but important to understand that within Site we can assign many things as a site. So here are just some examples we'll go through just to illustrate that point. So the top left, we have displacement sites. That will probably be most familiar to everyone here. And this would be for, you're using Site for camp governance projects and activities. Then moving along, we have damaged homes or buildings, and then we have infrastructure under construction. So we have a construction site. Essentially, we have damaged homes and buildings, and both of those points could also be sites. That would be for construction or shelter-oriented programming, if that's what you're doing on Site. Then we have a town or a village. So here, I think this will be especially important to consider for people who are using a area-based methodology approach. So important because a town or village could be a region. However, in this instance, especially if you're doing an area-based approach, you're collecting data at the town or village level. And if you're collecting data at that level, then you'd want to consider it a site, essentially. And we'll go on to that in a bit more detail in some of the next slides. And then finally, we have water points or latrines. So here, this might be a site also, and you might set this up as a site because you want to on Site conduct project monitoring of water quality, service monitoring of the service functionality, and you could do that for any service point that you have. So you could really think about that with respect to service monitoring in your projects. So again, very few limitations on what a site can be. A site can be many, many things. Sites should really reflect how teams work in the real world. So a good rule of thumb for this is if you're unclear on what a site can be, the best way to think about it is to think about what your team says every day. In terms of what they're doing for work, so if you have teams that say, okay, we're going to point X today and also point Y to conduct these assessments, to fill in these fill in these forms, then you might consider that point X, that place where they're going, collecting that data, should be the sites. But an obvious question you might have is, if a site is so flexible for what it can be, then why are we organizing by sites at all? So the reason why we organize by sites on site is because it provides practical benefits in your workflow in the project itself. And in this slide, we'll go over what those benefits are. So the reasons we use sites are for these 5 reasons over here. So user management. Sites are very helpful in that we can control user permissions by site. This is to say that you might have user permissions on site for a number of different actors working in different organizations. They might not have the need to have access to all of the sites, but they might work in some specific sites. And so we can control user permissions so they only get access to the sites that they need. Also, with respect to data management, so data is on site is separately managed by location. So it gives a very clear unit of where data should be stored and where it's located. And that's probably the primary reason why it's important to have sites as the essentially the unit of measurement on site. So also in terms of form deployment, so we can control the deployment of form. This can be done by region and by sites. And this can be very helpful if you know that only if specific activities are being conducted only at certain sites. Data sharing, so much easier to filter data, more easy to separate, appropriate for sharing across organizations to authorities. So once you have sites as a clear focal point for where the data is being stored, it also makes it very easy for data sharing. You could have quite clear roles within your data set, with sites being the each row. And mapping and visualization. So it allows you to have a unit of observation, essentially, which allows for mapping, visualization activities. And this can be automated quite easily on site. Mapping and visualization will be something we'll cover in more detail in a future topic, in a future presentation. So now we're going to move on to some of the more practical stuff. So site creation and editing. Okay, so here we're going to look at creating a site IDs and the naming conventions of sites. We're also going to be looking at how to edit and delete sites. We're going to see that sites are created from a project dashboard and they have a minimum required information. The minimum required data field that need to be filled in are site ID, site name, and site location. So right now we're just going to run a quick demo, just looking at that process of creating a site. Okay, so here you have your project dashboard. As always, you'll just click on projects and you'll go into your projects. As Danny mentioned last week, we will be able to see a lot of your projects. You will probably only have one or any projects that are in your operation. So you'll click on your project, you'll go into project settings, go into site, and then look at site list. So in order to create a new site, you want to click on this small button over here, which says Add Site. And as you'll see, you have a number of data fields that you can fill, but you'll see that the ones which are mandatory are the site ID, site name, and site location. Site location would usually be a point. You can either put the coordinates in there, or you can select it yourself on the map, and that will give you the coordinates. Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. There'll be some more details there, but that was just to show you the very basic overview of where you find it on your project dashboard. Okay, so site ID versus site name. Those were the first 2 data fields that you saw when creating a site. They're both mandatory, and they're both very important to include in your projects. Some key differences here, though. A site ID should be unique, and it's essentially a primary key. What we mean by a primary key is that it's a database, a system identifier. That means it should be readable by machines, so it can help us with bulk uploads, bulk operations, essentially. For it to be machine readable, it needs to be unique. It needs to not have any spaces or special characters, right? So as discussed before, you want to avoid things like exclamation marks, periods, commas. You can't use underscores and hyphens. Those are usually accepted in primary keys. Site names, on the other hand, don't have to be unique. Spaces are okay, and they're used for display and human readable. So essentially think, obviously, for a site name, you want it to be something that people understand, whatever people call the site. Site ID has to be what the machine can understand the site to be. So both are searchable in your Site project dashboard. When you're in your project dashboard, you can put the name or even part of the name into the search and find all of the results. And you can do the same with the site ID. Okay, so now looking at some best practices for site ID naming conventions. So when you're creating your site IDs, it will have to be an alphabetical numeric combination to convey some sort of meaning. You want it to be consistent. Once you start with some kind of combination, then you have to carry over that combination across your project. So let's say, as an example, I'm currently taking this call, conducting this training from London. If I was working on a new site in London, I might name that LDN, some kind of short for London, hyphen 001, meaning the first site in London. Coordinate with cluster and or authority. So these are really important best practices before you start with site ID conventions. If there's already a site ID convention, which is generally accepted by the authorities and the humanitarian community, then there's no real need to create a new one, add to more confusion. Never reuse site IDs, even if deleted. So that's quite important. If you have a site ID that a site that exists and then you delete it from the system, it's still very important not to use that same site ID. Just move on to the next site ID. There's some important reasons for that. The main reason is that you might be looking at historical data, and then if you have both the old site and the new site with the same site ID, you're going to run into some problems with duplicated information, which isn't accurate. The general rule of thumb, to be fair, we'll come on to this in a bit more detail later, is not to delete sites that are no longer active or in use. So on site, it's very easy to change the status of sites. So you shouldn't actually really need to delete sites in general. So the final advice here is to create the convention at the start. So changing is very time consuming, difficult and confusing. I've been involved in a few operations where we've changed site ID conventions in the middle or started in the middle. And it's been very, very difficult. So make sure that when you start in a mission, it's one of the first things that you do. So here's an example of a site ID convention. This is an example from Ukraine. Here you can see the first two letters are a country code. The country codes, as well as the second part, which is 3504, that's the official code of the second administrative unit. Those can usually be found online. You can get them from government databases, authority databases sometimes. You can also normally get them from HDX datasets, where you should have existing official codes for all of these things, countries and administrative units. So the final point is -001. You can see this is a useful way of naming a site. This would be the first site in that district. So that's essentially the convention, and we'd keep that consistent as we keep working through the project. The 00 padding is also useful because that can help us essentially keep the style consistent and move it all the way up to 999. So editing and deleting sites, we're going to do a quick demo on this. First, just to mention that it requires the correct permissions. This training session isn't on permission, so we won't go into that into any more detail here. We will have another training on user permissions. But just here, suffice to say that as IMs or project managers, here you should have the correct permissions to edit and delete sites. So there are two ways to edit and delete sites. The first is site list in project settings. The second is site settings on the site dashboard, and then the site list from the top bar. So really important here, deleted sites are not recoverable. So as we said before, usually you don't really want to delete sites. The main two reasons you might have to delete sites is you've created them by accident, and there's no data inside it, or you have duplicate sites on site and there's no correct data inside the duplicate site. And those might be the two reasons you delete it. If you stop working in a site, if a site becomes inactive, if it closes down even, you wouldn't want to delete it. Usually you'd want to change the status. So let's now move on to the demonstration here. I'm just going to go over how to edit and how to delete the site very briefly. So as always, we navigate to the project page. The first thing we do is we go into settings and we go back into sites. Then we go into site list. So over here, you have all of your sites. This is a test space, a project space that I've set up for these training series. And let's just click on the first site, for example. You click on these three dots and you have the option to edit over here. So all of the information that I showed you when you create a site is the same that pops up here when you're looking at editing the site. And we'll go into a bit more detail on some of these data fields over here. So that would be how you edit a site. You can also click on these three dots and you delete a site over here. So you click that delete, you'll get a confirmation. And if you're 100% sure you want to delete, then you click on delete over there. Again, not recoverable. You can also, as the other way to delete or edit sites, you can access your sites from the top dashboard over here. So you might just click on that and you'd go onto view all sites. Here I would have all of the sites from many different projects, but you would just have the sites which you specifically work in. You go into these three dots and you have the same options over here. So those are the two ways in which you can edit and delete sites. So in fact, now we'll go on to regions. So regions are essentially larger geographic units. Usually, that's how they usually manifest in Zeit. They are the important thing to consider about a region is they're not a unit for data collection. So there's no forms associated with regions. You can't click on a region and say, I want to put in information on how many people live in this region, for example, population figures. There's no data collection that happens within the region. So usually they are then for organizing and grouping sites, applying user permissions, and easy filtering of data exports, essentially. So primarily for organization, user permissions, and filtering. So we'll just look at some of the differences and similarities between sites and regions. So we have data collection and dedicated dashboard that belongs to sites only, and that would be because they're the unit of observation, what we're collecting data within. Regions would be just for organization in that context, so they wouldn't have any data collection. Form deployment happens at both levels, and that would make sense for you guys in your projects. So you might have, you know, that you have a cache activity, which is going on in specific regions. So you want to deploy the form only in those regions, the monitoring of cache form, for example. And you'd have the same for sites, right? You might have it for very specific site types. So you could form deploy based on either of those. Grouping, we have it for both with slightly different purposes, hence the different colors. Grouping for regions is its primary structure, and grouping for sites is something which can be done, but you can group sites and subsites together essentially, but it's not the primary function of a site. So user permission, very similar to form deployment, can be done at both site and region level. Customizable data field, so the information that you can collect about the site or region, that only exists for sites. For regions, you have preset options for what you must fill in. There's no additional customizable data fields there. required for projects is only sites. So you don't need a region for your projects. If it doesn't help you for your project, then best not to include. Um, so now moving on, that if you don't need to use regions, why would you choose to use regions? And there's four reasons here. So let's say, for example, you have a large number of sites, and that large number of sites is causing a messy dashboard, which isn't quite clear. So in that situation, you might want to organize it better into regions. Similarly, if you have a very wide geographic coverage, it might just make sense to kind of start splitting into regions. For reporting or sorting data information, this would be very common, for example, for your internal reporting requirements, also for cluster reporting requirements for Ws. You might need to say not only this many sites received NFI distributions, you might also want to say 500 sites within this region received NFI assistance. So would be quite commonly used for that purpose. Mapping and visualization. So if you desire either internal mapping within site or external mapping outside of site, it can help quite massively with that and can be automated if you've put the regions in correctly. So in terms of a region hierarchy, this is just one example of how this might look like, just to convey the concept essentially. So you have level 1 being the largest group and the parent of all 3 levels. So that in this example is Asia. And then level 2 might be South Asia, so a segment that lives within Asia. And then level 3 over here, which is in yellow, is Nepal. So that's how a region hierarchy might go. In your projects, what would usually make sense is that if you're covering an entire country for an operation, then your level 1 usually doesn't have to be that country, because that would be everything in the project anyway. Level 1 is usually something like city or province. Level 2 would usually be the district, and 3 would be the sub-district. Okay, so we'll just look at how to add regions now. I'll just go through what the 4 requirements are here. You have the region ID, that's a primary key, which is required, and no spaces. You have the region name, again, similar to sites, required and spaces are okay. Geometry is optional. They have to be WKT format. And the best practice is to use OCHA PICOs, existing PICOs, essentially, existing convention standards when possible as region IDs, as well as their names, just to have comparability across data sets, essentially. So right now, we're just going to take a moment to do another demonstration of how to add a region within this training project that we have set up. So as always, we'll go into projects, we'll go into the IAM training series, and then we'll go into project settings. We'll then go into sites and look at regions. So over here, you'll see a visual representation of your regions and the hierarchy of regions. And you can see that by the indentations, essentially. So over here, you can see the part which is the most left indented is the first level region. And then over here, you have the second level region and another second level region over here. You can see that on the same indent. A third level region and, another second level region, a fourth second level region, and a fifth one. And then over here, you can also see that you have all of the third level regions, which belong to each of the other second level regions. So that should be fairly easy to see and understand, I think. Now, in terms of adding a region, you can do that in 2 ways, essentially depending on what you would like to do. So if I would like to add a sub-region, either beneath Asia, so beneath the first level region, so another country, essentially, in this example, I would add right over here. If I want to add another city, another third level region, I'd add right over here. Of course, you would have to choose where you want to add that city if you are choosing a city. And finally, if you want to choose just another region which isn't connected to anything, so that would be a first level region, then you would go right to the bottom and you'll see here, add region. So let's just do this bottom one, for example. you would click add region. Let's say since the first one is Europe, is Asia, we'll use Europe over here. So you might have Europe and EUR as the region ID. And then you would have the geometric object if you had it. For this, I won't go into too much detail about this, but you will need some basic GIS experience usually to get this. Usually you just essentially have to get the polygon shape from the GIS file, and you should use GIS for that. You can, it will allow you as well here, just as a feature, to draw the polygon itself. It's obviously not recommended, but let's just say for this example, you get the shape file over here like this. Once you have this information, you'll click save, and now you'll see you have a new region. This would be a first level region. You can see the indent all the way to the left. So I'm just going to delete this, delete it in the same way as sites. So as not so. Okay, subsites. So subsites are essentially sites nested under a different sites. They have all the same functionalities of a site. They just belong to another site essentially. They're a useful way to organize site lists, especially if you're working in large sites. This table, I'm not going to go through in any detail here. It has the same rows as the table we showed before, but essentially here I just want to show that data collection dashboards happen at the site and subsite level, not at the regional level, although region will organize your dashboard potentially. Form deployment occurs at all of those levels. User permission assignment also. Grouping happens to some degree at all of them as well, because you can group, all of these are grouping measurements of each other essentially. And what's really important here is that sites are the only thing that's required for a project. You don't need to have a subsite if you don't want to, and you don't need to have regions if it's not necessary. So examples of subsites here, you might, within a displacement site, have a safe space woman, you might have latrines, and you might have subblocks. Examples. In a dormitory, you might have the floor, you might have different buildings within the dormitory, different rooms, different shelters within a dormitory. Within a town, if your town is your site, remember, you might then have, as possible subsite, shelters within that town. You might have shops, you might have medical facilities, water points, latrines, anything which might be something where you want to measure data or collect data at. Office buildings, yeah, it might be floors or individual offices. So subsites have the same functionality as sites. They share profile information with sites, and the permissions that they have are inherited from the parent site. So you can nest up to 3 subsites within a site. So very similar to the way that regions are organized. Okay, so here we're just going to go over a quick demo on how to create a subsite. So you will turn on subsite in project settings, then you go to sites, and then you go to advanced settings. You go to the parent site, then you go to site settings, and you create the subsite. So the first bullet point is how to turn subsites on. The second is how you actually create the subsite itself. So let's just quickly have a look at how we might do that. So to start, we go back to the project page. We'll then go into settings, we'll go into sites, and we'll go into advanced settings. So over here, you will see that you'll first have to enable the subsite. So this is already checked for you guys. As you go to your project, it might not be checked, so you'll have to check that first. Once you've checked that, you will create the subsite within the site itself. So let's go to our site list, and we'll say in this site over here, we might want to create a subsite. So here we'll go into the tab over here, and we have subsite. So we'll just click create subsite. Here we would take the same code and add a hyphen usually, I would imagine, but let's just use a random ID. Let's say it's office block 12, and you'll set the location just like you would if it were a usual site. And then you would create that site. Once you've created that site, you now have a Office Block 12 within a parent site and the Gen site 12. So that's essentially how you would create a subsite within a site, and you will now be able to see that a bit more clearly within the site list. Okay, site types. We're now looking at some of the data fields for sites. So site types are optional data field. They're used to categorize sites. You can use site types in any which way that works best for your project. So again, think about what's best for your project here. I'm going to give some examples here of what site types might be. They might be the typology of a site. For example, you might have a project where you have lots of different, you have informal settlements, and you have lots of different site types. So within that, you might have for site type, you'll have tents, you'll have self-made shelters, you'll have containers, for example. You might also instead use for site types organization that works in the site. So let's say you have acted that work in your project, you have IOM and you have NRC. Then you might have for site type, you might have the organization that works in that site. And we'll go on to why that might be useful in a second. So how they're used, grouping sites on dashboards. So for example, you would have a dashboard, even the automated one on site, and you would be able to see, for example, different colors for different site types. So you would be able to very clearly see that I have a map here. This is all of the different typologies of sites: self-settled, containers, self-made shelters. Or you'd see in different colors the different organizations, and that might be very helpful to visualize that way. Assign user permissions. So this would especially be helpful if you set the site types as organization that works in the site. So for example, if you had a grouping of sites that, let's say, is acted, then as you give users access to site and they work for acted, so anyone with an acted email address, for example, would only be allowed permissions to the site type of acted, right? So very similar for deploying forms. You might know that, for example, let's say site type now is the typology of the site. You might know that you're only doing, you have an activity of tent repairs, and that will only be done for sites which are tents. And so then you would potentially deploy those forms only to that type of site. So again, the final one is just a filter. So obviously, if you have this type, it would be very easy to filter across now. So very similar to site and regions, you do have the primary key, and that would be the site type ID, and then you have the site type name. You need to include both of these. Both of them are easy to change. Again, the ID will just have to be no special characters. Remember, you can still use underscores and hyphens. So very quickly, I'm just going to go to adding site types. The instructions for this: navigate to settings, under sites, click site types, then add site type, add the ID and name. And then we'll also look at assigning the site type to a specific site. So as always, we're in our project, we go into project settings. We look at sites, we go into site types. So here, as you can see, I've already added the site types. And in this example, the site type is the organization that works or manages the site. So I have acted, I have DRC, I have IOM, I have NRC. So if I wanted to add a new site type, I'll just click here and I just put, let's say if it was DRC, for example, and here the identifier, I might put the entire full name over here and the identifier to keep as DRC. Okay, so once you have site type, so obviously with my example that I gave before, I had typology and I had organization. I can't have both of those. I have to choose one to be the site to work as the site type. So if I go to my site list, over here, I can see that under type, I have the already existing types, which I've coded in prior to starting this training. If I wanted to change that in any way, I would go into these three dots, I'd go edit, and I would under type, I'd have all of these options over here, okay? I could also click none, for example, just to keep it out of types whatsoever. But let's say for this one, I'm going to keep it as IOM, and then I will then save. So site status, put this together, quite important to consider in conjunction with site types. It's also a site information, a data field, a metadata of the site. It indicates the status of the site. It allows you to remove sites from a list if they're closed or no longer in operation. So the site comes with some default site statuses. Those are, I believe, active, inactive, and upcoming, for example. Now you could also add some statuses. So maybe you want to design and label your own status to use in projects. Let's say, for example, you wanted to create a status that was pending inactive. So for example, you just needed more confirmation that it was inactive, but you think that it was inactive. So you might create that yourself. This feature will allow you to remove and hide sites. So if you don't want to show sites that are inactive, you don't have to see them. And you wouldn't collect, it would allow you to turn off submissions for the site. So the most obvious example for that is when a site is inactive, then there wouldn't be any reason to allow any form submissions to that site because there wouldn't be activities happening in that site. So if you did collect forms in that site, it might be by mistake, and that's what we'd want to remove with this feature. So why use site statuses? The obvious reason, the first reason is to avoid deleting sites. So you keep the data on site when you change the status, but you prevent users from adding new data. You also want to hide inactive sites from users. They might cause a very clogged kind of dashboard. So just to keep it clean, easier to read, you might want to hide those. Also, just to get an understanding of managing the lifecycle of a site, right? So you will initially have a site at the plan stage, it will then move to active, and then potentially inactive at the end. And then also to filter and navigate the site list and data export. So for obvious reasons, you might have a donor request for a report which just looks at the active sites. And that will be very easy to filter this way. You could also show all the inactive sites as well as sites which are planned for the next quarter, for example. So site status, how do we set those up? So again, we navigate to project settings, we go to sites and then site status. Then we will create edit statuses and relating settings. And then you can choose whether those sites should be shown on the mobile app. And you also choose whether sites of that status should be allowed to receive data. So let's just quickly have a look at that now before we move on to questions. So as always, we're in our project, then we go into project settings. We'll go into sites. Now this time, instead of site types, as we looked at earlier, we'll look at site status. So here we have the default versions. Active is default. That means that's what it's going to show is if you create a site and you don't set it as anything yourself. We have completed, we have inactive, and we have upcoming. So you can see, let's just have a look at these three dots. We'll click on edit. So under active, we have a status color. We can see that it shows on the mobile application and it receives submissions, which is what you would want from active sites. Now, on the other hand, inactive should have restricted for both of them. So we'll go into edit and you see the color makes sense, doesn't show on mobile, and you cannot receive submissions in a closed site. If you want to add a status, you click on this button here. You might call this pending closure. And then you might give it the color gray, and you want it to still receive submissions, for example, and you don't want it to show on the mobile app. So you might just save that, and then you have a new status for your sites. Site information fields. So what are the site information fields? So these are data fields associated with sites as part of the site profile. So the default ones, we spoke about this before, are site name, site ID, and site location. Those essentially are mandatory fields. You'll need to fill those in. optional suggested fields. You have address, you have phone, you have site type, and site status. So we spoke about those. Those exist. You can designate what those fields are to some level, right? So site type, you choose what you mean by site type in your project, what makes the most sense for site type, and site status would be the same. That you can you have some default fields, but you can then choose different ones. So custom fields are designated by the user. So that's designated by you. You can choose what else you want your site, what other information you want your site to have, right? So maybe you have sites and you want to include population, for example. You want to include capacity for your as a custom field. So that means that within your site's data, metadata, profile, for example, however is easiest for you to think about it, you have all of these fields. You have site name, site ID, and then you also have capacity, right? Or population. So here are just some examples. I won't go through all of them, but some of these are the mandatory ones. And others are ones that exist as site fields, but you don't have to fill those in. Yeah. And so you have things like address, phone number, descriptions. These would usually make sense, but you can customize these in any which way that you want. So let's take address, for example. You might want to put in, instead of address, you might want to put in road and building number. That sometimes is a way that clusters require it to be reported. You could put that in as your own way of tracking site information. Okay, and that moves us on to this slide. So additional custom fields, as I've just said, can be added to sites. You have a range of different data types supported. So that new custom field could be an integer, let's say a number, for example. That could be capacity of site, so 300, let's say, for one site. It could be text. It could be select one, select multiple, for example. That might be organizations that work in sites. And could be a date. The date could be the date the MOU with the government was signed, for example, for establishing this site. You could have attachments. You could have the contracts, for example, related to that site also within it. You could have phone numbers, etc. One very specific data type I wanted to just quickly focus on is the pull data from form type. So this can be used to update a field based on the value of a field in a COBOL form. So as an example, let's just take the example of capacity. Let's say if you add that as a custom data field with data type integer, that means that when someone's creating a site or editing a site, they can manually input the capacity as a number. Another option you have here is, let's say you know that within the sites in your project, site monitoring is ongoing, and they put that data in anyway every month, and you want it to update every month. So what you might do is you'd put capacity, and instead of using integer, you'd use pull data from form type. So essentially what will happen then is that the data field of capacity will update every time someone puts in a site monitoring into that site. So if someone submits a site monitoring into that site, then the capacity updates automatically. We'll have a look at that, how to do that practically as well in just a second. Okay, so site information settings, setting site information fields, creating custom fields, optional automation from forms and types of fields. This is just, we'll see this in a sec, how to essentially add custom fields. The name of the custom field is what will appear to the user, so that will just be something like capacity, and hint, you can also preset to provide some guidance here. So let's just quickly have a look at how to do that. Okay, so we go into our project. As always, we go into project settings, we'll go into sites, and this time we'll go into site information. So we'll see that within site information, we have some of the topics we already covered. We have site status, we have site type. These two tabs over here, which we covered previously. So we have a number of other fields. And we also have the option here to turn on the custom field. So let's have a look at the custom field here. So let's say we want to do a custom field of population. And you might call it IDP is present. So here you have the option of it being a numerical, right? And you can then make this field required. And here you'd say enter population data. So every time someone creates or edits a site, they'll have this option and it will be mandatory for them. So we'll press save over here, and you can see that you now have it in custom fields. Now, if we want to do that same field, we would, but pulling the data from a form, we might say population IDPs present. Let's here just say from form. Here we'll put as the option, draw answer from form. And the form is going to be, you have all your forms over here. These are the forms associated to this project. We don't have a site monitoring here, so I'm just going to take any random information. Let's say I take the activity report, and then over here, you have all of the questions that exist within that activity report, right? So here I'm just going to take participants total. In real life, this will be something more like population total. And I'll click that and then save. You'll notice that there was no option to make it mandatory. That's because you don't actually put this question in. This will be something which draws automatically. So now if I go to a site, let's call it site A, I put in a site monitoring form, then the site information details is going to update automatically. So now let's just have a look. We'll go into site list. Let's say now I create a new site. You can see I have all the same data fields as before, but I will also have the population. That was the first one we made, which was to enter the population data ourselves. Today, custom views. Okay, so custom view is essentially how do I in Zeit customize the site dashboard to make it look easier for me to see. The default mode is you have a project dashboard and you also have site dashboards. Okay, so in your site dashboard, in your project dashboard, let's say you have all of your sites. In your site dashboard, you have all of the information related to all of your sites. So the default mode of this is that you show all of the cases in one. That's what most people have. You can customize this, create organized folders of cases within sites. Sometimes makes things look more organized and easier to see. So the following filters are available. You can do it by submitted date. You can do it by status, tags, forms, or user roles. So there's a number of different things you can choose about how to customize your dashboard and make it easier to see. Let's take one, for example, and this will be my last demo for today. You will go to project settings as always. You go to dashboards, then site custom views. You create new or edit, and then you try and look at how you think about how you want it to be filtered. So for example, let's say you have in your forms, you have site monitoring and FGDs. You want to put those together under assessments because you want to keep referrals separately. That might be one way to do it. So let's just have a quick demo on how to do that. So we go to IAM training series. As always, we go into project settings. Now this time, instead of going into sites, we go into dashboards and we look at the site custom view. Okay, so this project has two views already. These are, let's just have a look at this one. This is last 7 days. So it means that you view the submissions in each site by the last 7 days. Let's say I want to create a new view, which is assessments only. Here I would view submissions by forms. So here I would do activity report, let's say, and just the activity report in this instance, right? So I put those in as assessments only. Let's say I also want to create a time-bound view. So I don't want to have all of my cases because it looks messy. I want to only see cases that happened in the last month, let's say. So let's say last month only. And I might, for that, use a rolling period. So the period changes and I'll put in the last 30 days. So now in my dashboard, I only see what happened in the last 30 days. as one of the tabs. Sorry, not I only see that. You still have all of your information, but you specifically can organize that way. So now let's have a look at what that might look like. We'll go back into projects and let's just click on a site to see the site dashboard. Okay, so here, this was the one I just created. It says assessments only. So as you can see over here in this test site, we have a number of different activities and referrals. And if we go into assessments only, we'll hopefully only see the ones which were assessments, right? So here we now no longer see the referral. So again, just think about it as a way of, just like you might have folders in your email inbox, this would be the same thing. This would be the last 7 days rolling. That one was created before. I only have one, which was done in the last 7 days. As you can see, the other ones were this is 20th of January. And I believe the other cases were done on the 19th of January, right? So we can see. And the last month only, the one we just created right now, if we have a look at that, that should show all of the cases, right? So because all of them would have happened in the last 30 days. So those are just some examples. You can have a play around with that feature, see what makes sense for you to see in your site dashboard and what's easiest for you, essentially. So that, I believe, will be everything from my side.